Representative Nonoy Defensor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to direct my questions to the good Justice Adolfo Ascuna. I never had the opportunity to appear for an oral argument before the Supreme Court, and I am humbled by this opportunity to ask a Justice of the Supreme Court. As one of the framers of the 1987 Constitution, Mr. Justice, can you tell us, what do you think are the most important provisions of our Constitution as a whole?
The most important provision of our Constitution as a whole is the Commander-in-Chief provision. Who is the Commander-in-Chief?
Will you agree with me that the Bill of Rights are also the most important, or one of the most important provisions of our Constitution?
Yes, I would also agree with you. There are really many most important provisions. Article 17 is another one.
I'm glad that you agree with me that the Bill of Rights, which include the freedom of speech, amending the Constitution to allow women to vote, allowing people to vote regardless of race or sex, because the Bill of Rights, Mr. Justice, is a mere amendment to the American Constitution. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
And if they did not allow any amendment to their Constitution, we would have no Bill of Rights, women will not be able to vote, and so many other things, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, as well as all the other rights vested in their Constitution. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chair. Although in our case, the late Lino Broca was able to amend the Bill of Rights and in fact improve it by adding freedom of expression.
That's correct.
Something that even the United Nations has recognized, because there is now a special rapporteur of the United Nations for freedom of expression.
That's correct. My point is that we should not be afraid of change or amendments, because we might just find out by trying an amendment that it is good for us. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
I had to ask that because our Constitution, especially our very first Constitution, the 1935 Constitution, was adopted using the American Constitution, which already has 27 amendments, and those amendments, some of which contain enactment clauses, specifically 6 enactment clauses, similar to our proposed phrase, unless otherwise provided for. There are 6 enactment amendments or enactment phrases in the United States Constitution, which reads, "The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Mr. Chair, before we used to think that the world is flat, we used to think that everything revolves around the earth. But people stood up on the right side and stood up for what is correct, and now we are on the right side of history. Going further to the phrase, "unless otherwise provided by law," there is a concern or an issue raised that the phrase, "unless otherwise provided by law," could be construed as another form of amendment to the Constitution. And that it was raised that why don't the authors themselves already fix the limits for equity of foreign investors? Mr. Chief Justice, just to give the members and the public a better perspective of what we are talking about. Can you distinguish for us in very plain language what is legislative power and what is constituent power?
There's really two ways of making these changes. One is to make the percentages.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you. As a justice of the Supreme Court, we respectfully request that you distinguish for us, in the simplest terms, what does legislative power mean and what does constituent power mean?
The legislative power is the power to make ordinary laws, whereas constituent power is the power to propose changes, amendments, or revisions in the Constitution.
And by that, do you agree with me na kapag sinabi nating nagpo-propose tayo ng amendment sa ating konstitusyon by inserting the phrase unless otherwise provided by law, that is an exercise of our constituent power? Correct?
I agree, Mr. Chair.
And once that phrase inserted in the Constitution, unless otherwise provided by law, has been approved by all Filipinos in a plebiscite, such that it is already included in our Constitution, the laws passed by Congress under the phrase unless otherwise provided by law is an exercise of our legislative power. Am I correct, sir?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Are you familiar with the delegation of powers, Mr. Justice?
That is not delegation, but an authorization, I think, Mr. Chair.
I agree, sir. Mr. Justice, since it has authorized Congress, do you agree with me that the proposal to include unless otherwise provided by law and whatever laws may be passed by Congress subsequently is an exercise is a political question for members of Congress to decide? Is that correct, sir?
That is correct, Your Honor. It's a question of wisdom now, and therefore it's a political act.
Thank you for confirming that, Mr. Justice. Mr. Chairman, in the case of Tañada versus Cuenco, 100 Phil, page 105, 1957, the Supreme Court defined a political question as those questions which, under the Constitution, are to be decided by the people in their sovereign capacity or in regard to which full discretionary authority has been delegated to the legislative or executive branch of government. Clearly, inserting the phrase unless otherwise provided by law should not be considered as another form of amending the Constitution under Article 17. It is delegation by the Constitution to Congress na magpasa ng batas kung ano ang nararapat na ilagay na equity restriction. Halimbawa, in telecommunications, kapag napaaprubahan po natin ang unless otherwise provided by law, hindi po ibig sabihin na 100% ng telecommunications ay pwede ng pagmamay-ari ng isang banyaga. Pwede pong ilagay natin na 60-40 pa din. Pwedeng 100% ang telecommunications na pagmamay-ari ng mga dayuhan. Ngunit, bakit mahalaga na nasa kontrol ng Kongreso itong equity limitations? Kasi kung maganda naman palang 100% pwedeng pagmamay-ari ng dayuhan at nakakabuti sa ating lahat with the safeguards provided in the law, bakit hindi natin gawin? Makakabuti yon sa tao. Pero dahil nilagay natin unless otherwise provided by law, kung hindi pala maganda na ibibigay natin ang 100% ownership ng telecommunications, transportation, railway, pwedeng bawiin ng ating lehislatura o ng Kongreso para ibalik natin sa 60-40 para tayo na naman ulit ang may majority stake at may control. I had to ask that just to clarify to everyone, especially the public, to distinguish legislative power, constituent power, and how it applies to inserting the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. Next. May I ask Yusek Edilion of the National Economic Development Authority. In all the data presented by those for amending the Constitution or the economic provision and by those against amending the economic provision, pare-pareho pong malinaw na base sa inyong datos, countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam are less restrictive or the least restrictive sa kanilang economic provisions. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Does it also mean that just because they are less restrictive in their economic provisions, ay effectively controlled na ang ekonomiya nila ng mga dayuhan kasi less restrictive sila?
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
I agree with you. Does it mean that if we open up public utilities, let's say transportation, let's say distribution, does it automatically mean na effectively controlled na ng dayuhan ang ating ekonomiya?
Hindi rin po.
And do you agree with me that when we say a self-reliant economy, effectively controlled, ang word na economy is a very, very broad term that encompasses everything, not just industries. Do you agree? Yes or no?
Yes.
And does it mean that if we amend the Constitution using these three provisions, automatic ba na effectively controlled na ang ekonomiya ng ating bansa? Yes or no? Thank you for confirming that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.